Hello students, welcome to EPE Pathshala. I am Dr. Surya Prakash Upadhyay from Indian Institute of Technology, Mandi. Today we are going to talk on module Logics of Segregation from paper Sociology of Urban Transformations. So in this module, you will learn about the idea of segregation and how it has been defined. It explores the history of the concept of segregation in Indian context and look at the international perspectives and approaches and how segregation has been understood. Segregation is best reflected in housing patterns. You look at your city. A few localities are very posh and full with facilities, while there would be localities and areas that are dominated by poor and not so well off people. In fact, the housing boards used to create houses on the basis of segregating different economic groups. For example, the houses such as EWS, that is for economically weaker section, LIG, MIG, HIG, were all developed on the basis of economic standings of the people. Therefore, we'll look at the patterns of residential segregation. So towards the end of this module, we will look at relationship between segregation and spatial inequalities and how it perpetuates other forms of inequalities in any city. So, how do we define or understand socio-spatial segregation? Dupont defines socio-spatial segregation as spatial distinctions among the residential zones of population groups living in the same urban agglomeration. So the segregation does not reflect only in the residences, but also in the schools, workplaces, public space, shopping areas, and so on. So spatial segregation has been widely studied in North American cities such as Chicago and New York, where processes of ghettoization and hyper-segregation were the most visible manifestation of social discrimination towards African Americans and Hispanic communities. In India, spatial segregation has not received the scholarly attention it deserves. Often, studies on caste, gender, religion, and other forms of ascription typically overlook spatial dimensions. Therefore, bringing together the analytical frameworks of spatial segregation and social stratification in India into a single unifying lens presents a challenge. Hence, this module is an attempt in that direction. While this module will not survey the methodological and theoretical approaches of segmentation, a few conceptual understandings are required. First, a note on how segregation has been understood in the discipline of urban sociology. Dupont translates this definition from the French of Brun, as scholars have noted that the earliest models of urban ecology at the Chicago schools by scholars such as Robert Park and Ernest Burgess evolved to explain social homogeneity of localities within the city. These authors approach the concept of segregation differently. In their ecological understanding, the city and its spatial organization was looked in organic terms and as the outcome of processes of selection and competition among different social groups for scarce resources such as land. The ethnic enclave was produced by the geographic clustering of ethnic, particularly immigrant groups, or around common economic activities or industries. Within the heterogeneity of the early 20th century city, the neighborhood was an island of homogeneity and social cohesion. Another understanding was suggested by Ernest Burgess, who argued that segregation also applied to competing land use in Chicago. Differential land and rental rates served to segregate residential zones from commercial areas and high income from low income residents. These early Chicago school ideas came to be challenged, but they have also proved very influential. So in this module, we analyze the nature of socio-spatial segregation and its impact. In the next sections, we will look at the evidence and theorization of segregation in the international context, particularly the United States. The module widens the scope to look at the nature of socio-spatial segregation in broader comparative context. The remaining sections examine the evidence from India and how international models can be applied to the Indian case. We pay particular attention to the nature of segregation in cities such as Delhi and Ahmedabad and highlight the implications and origins of these socio-spatial divisions. The American sociologist Marcuse developed three conceptual categories to describe spatial segregation: ghetto, enclave, and citadel. A ghetto is a spatially concentrated area used to separate and to limit a particular involuntarily defined population group held to be and treated as inferior by the dominant society, says Marcuse. Ghettoized minorities do not choose to segregate voluntarily and have little influence over how they are viewed by the larger society. Ghettos are places that face stigma. Most cities have something resembling to a ghetto. Red light areas like Kamathipura in Mumbai could be termed a ghetto. Scholars continue to debate the nature of the ghetto and of exclusion it represents. Is the class central line or ethno-racial, or in the case of India, communal and caste-based exclusions? We return to these questions in a later section. The notion of enclave suggests a different point of origin for spatial segregation. It refers to a spatially concentrated area in which members of a particular population group, self-defined by ethnicity or religion or otherwise, congregate as a means of enhancing their economic, social, political, and or cultural development. Spatial segregation in the enclave is believed to be voluntary and, more importantly, beneficial to the minority. It allows the group to maintain its social cohesion, norms, and cultural values. The final category proposed by Marcuse is the citadel, which is a spatially concentrated area in which members of a particular population group, defined by its position of superiority in power, wealth, or status in relation to its neighbors, congregate as a means of protecting and enhancing that position. Thus, segregation in the citadel is unambiguously voluntary and based on class distinctions, though these may also overlap with caste or ethno-racial distinctions. Contemporary gated communities provide a perfect example of the citadel in that they are intended to exclude the poor from the high quality amenities available to residents. What is the link between the segregation and spatial inequality? The study of the impacts of segregation along ostensibly identity lines has received the most sustained and rigorous examination in the US. The work of Wilson, along with his student Louis Vacon, analyzed the economic dynamics underlying poverty in ghettos, dilapidated territorial areas that epitomize acute social and economic marginalization, where the urban poor were increasingly concentrated. Whereas previous commentaries had tended to blame the poverty and social dysfunction of the ghetto on the culture of African Americans in the ghetto, Wilson and Vacon argued that it was loss of opportunities through joblessness and economic exclusion that led to such a process of hyperghettoization, and that is a social and spatial concentration of poverty. Yet, the social ills were not the only symptom of this process. Such hyperghettoization was, in Wilson and Bacon's view, accompanied by loss of jobs and working families, as well as declining housing, healthcare, schools, businesses, recreational facilities, and community organization. Deindustrialization was one of its root cause. Douglas Massey's landmark work on American apartheid tackled head-on the bifurcation of American society into separate but unequal, racially determined segments. Massey and Denton asked how such deprivations intensified in the first place. They further argue, in fact, residential segregation provided the foundation for a regime of racial injustice. Douglas Massey's work shows that rising rates of poverty and high levels of residential segregation show strong interaction. In fact, when poverty rates among African Americans rise, poverty becomes more especially concentrated under conditions of segregation, feeding into a vicious cycle that ends in the creation of an unstable underclass. Massey's findings derive from quantitative simulations to demonstrate this cycle. As residential segregation measured by the dissimilarity index rises for a given level of poverty among blacks, so does the geographic concentration of poverty among them. Massey thus argues that as residential segregation increases, the geographic intensity, that is, concentration of poverty, also increases. This is because a given rise in poverty is experienced more intensely in poor minority neighborhoods, the higher the levels of segregation. Further, disparities between majority and minority neighborhoods continue to widen. Majorities are shielded from the effects of minority impoverishment. In other words, privileged groups gain and underprivileged group loss or lose as a result of segregation. Such spatial concentration of poverty can have drastic effects. That is, as purchasing power declines in minority neighborhoods, health services may withdraw and school quality may fall, leading to worsening health and education outcomes. And that is an outcome in mutually reinforcing and cumulative cycle. Massey's contribution lies in underlining the central role of residential segregation in concentrating black poverty in the US in the 1960s and the 1970s, but holds interesting implication for the processes of ghettoization in Indian cities as well. From a policy perspective, this suggests that policies that aim to address income and wealth inequalities alone would be insufficient to address especially concentrated poverty, where it also has an ethno-racial, caste or communal element. So now we can talk about segregation in a comparative perspective also. So Molutas and Fajita note that scholars are less attentive now to residential segregation in itself and more as an outcome of the urban transformations associated with neoliberalism and globalization. One strand of this thesis proposed by Saskia Sassen is social polarization. That is, the assumed outcome of economic restructuring for global cities, which become the strategic spaces for global capitalist management, and the rapid development of high-end producer services that generate high-profile and highly paid jobs, alongside simultaneous growth of menial jobs related to low-level tasks in the expanding sector of producer services, but also in the service of the expanding occupational elite, while the loss of secure and averagely paid jobs in industry completes the polarization trend by depleting the middle of the social hierarchy. This social polarization in turn leads to spatial polarization, with corporate capital taking over prime spaces in the city as rental and land values rise. One example of such market mechanisms that foster segregation is gentrification. That is, the dominant way of remodeling central urban areas affected by deindustrialization. deindustrialization by commodifying land to attract profitable land uses and high income residents, while at the same time driving away low income residents and low surplus generating land uses. Saskasassen's thesis has been challenged, but its contribution lies in highlighting how market mechanisms in some cases determine and in other cases reinforce patterns of segregation. Even where there are no discrimination based or institutional barriers, the price of housing in different areas may serve to keep out low income residents and uphold class based segregation. Malutas and Fujita make another interesting point that assumes importance as we evaluate the evidence on segregation in Indian cities. Although the studies of segregation typically focus on groups that face discrimination and ghettoization, higher social groups in fact have more agency and control over their own and others' patterns of segregation. Thus, considering only segregation of underprivileged groups may provide a misleading picture of the processes that drive segregation. Investigating the attitudes of affluent groups towards the urban poor in a comparative study of Delhi, Paris, Paris, and Sao Paulo, Cousin et al. Show how the self-segregation of the rich leads to differences in the socio-spatial mosaics of the three cities, while health and cleanliness considerations increasingly isolate Sao Paulo and Delhi elites in bubbles, that is, their neighborhoods and other areas they frequent. Parisian elites are concentrated to the center of the city and are able to take advantage of cities' public spaces. Indeed, looking at evidence from around the world, from sub-Saharan Africa to China and Brazil, Mike Davis points out that post-colonial elites have inherited and greedily reproduced the physical footprints of segregated colonial cities. In his work and in his classic study of Los Angeles, City of Courts, Mike Davis suggests that the rise of a planet of slums and the rise of exclusive, heavily guarded battlements of the rich are the two sides of the same coin. In the neoliberal era, spatial segregation has increasingly taken the shape of what the noted urbanist Saskasasan calls gating, which represents another form in which the rich self-segregate. Gated communities, which involve signing up to communally agreed agreements that allow for money to be charged for services, are increasingly visible feature of urban landscape, both in the global north and the global south. A number of theorizations have been proposed for this phenomenon, from rising urban crime and elite desire for safety to a demand for exclusive spaces. In the case of Sao Paulo, Caldeir has shown how the rise of gating has given rise to striking juxtapositions of poverty and enclosed wealth and led to the erosion of public spaces. You can also see the same thing in our module 6.7. So given the multiple fault lines that mark Indian society, that is those of religion, language, caste and class, it is no surprise that Indian cities are deeply fragmented places. Some data from a recent quantitative analysis of ward level census 2001 by Vidyathil and Singh highlights the extent to which 7 major Indian cities, that is Ahmedabad, Bangalore, Chennai, Delhi, Hyderabad, Kolkata and Mumbai, are divided by caste and class. The sociologists such as Vidyathil and Singh, who use quantitative methods, employ a metric called the dissimilarity index, which represents the proportion of the majority or minority population which would have to be redistributed so that each partial would have exactly the same composition as the city as a whole. Clearly, the higher the dissimilarity index, the higher the levels of segregation. Moreover, note that the perfect segregation with pure community clusters are also rare, but near perfect segregation is sometimes seen in Indian cities such as Ahmedabad. In the next subsections, we first delineate how divisions of caste or class and religion have manifested themselves in Indian cities, looking in detail at iconic examples from Delhi and Ahmedabad, which have been extensively analyzed by scholars. Next, we consider the more general mechanisms that generate and reinforce patterns of segregation in Indian city, in particular, the role of conflict, housing discrimination, and not least the applicability of the ghetto enclave citadel categorization introduced by Marcuse in the Indian case. Caste versus class. Class-based spatial segregation and attendant inequitable access to basic services remain unmistakable and highly visible features of urban India. To take but one example, tracing out the processes of class separation, Peace has highlighted how structured social inequalities are manifested in spatial layout of Jaipur city. Peace notes that the middle classes derived largely from the twice-born caste. The suggestion that the old city areas of Indian cities have become ghettos for the poor is echoed by the notification of slums in Shahjahanabad and Old Hyderabad. Yet, how do these economic inequalities reflect or correlate with castes, gender, and communal forms of segregation? While the social categories of gender and religion have evident spatial manifestation, the spatial markers of caste are often assumed to be dying out in the urban context. In fact, some scholars like Bethe and Chibber and Varshney, studying caste dynamics in urban India, have argued that city residents are gradually leaving behind their caste identities. However, others like Madheshwaran, Atwell, Vithel, and Singh contend that spatial segregation bolsters caste inequalities and perpetuates social stratification in India. As we have already seen, as we have already seen, contrary to the popular belief that caste inequality in India is being replaced by class inequalities, Vithyathil and Singh in their study on Pune found high levels of residential segregation by caste in India's 7 largest metro cities: Mumbai, Delhi, Kolkata, Chennai, Bangalore, Ahmedabad, and Hyderabad. Caste-based segregation often manifests itself as occupational segregation. Many occupations like fishing, leather work are considered as polluting work and usually engage people who are lower in the caste hierarchy. Communities engaged in these professions live in segregated spaces. For example, Dharavi in Mumbai, the largest slum in Asia, still houses Kumarpara or Potter's Colony or Koliwada or Fisherman Colony even today. Indeed, slums often represent processes of ghettoization for the low caste urban poor. In the late 19th century, Dharavi represented the outermost periphery of Mumbai, literally built on garbage dumped in marshy lands where polluting activities and undesired migrants were shunted off. Similar dynamics turned the tracts near Chembur and Ghatkopar into Dalit ghettos in the 1960s. It may be argued that these patterns show continuities with the spatial organization of Indian villages, where in accordance with the prescriptions ancient texts, Dalits were relegated to hamlets outside the center. DuPont argues caste in the contemporary Indian city is a far more complex phenomenon, while on the other hand, agglomerations have expanded to encompass Dalit-dominated peripheries. Residential, residential clustering on the basis of persists. DuPont's work also shows that Dalit populations tend to be clustered in slums rather than planned settlements in Delhi, in localities that are identifiable through names such as Harijan Colony or Ambedkar Nagar. Let us see how the interplay bit of caste and class take place in some cities, and we are taking here the example of Delhi. So cases such as DuPont's analysis of contemporary Delhi help illustrate the complex interplay of caste and class in contemporary Indian cities. DuPont notes that the patterns of spatial inequality that have come to characterize contemporary Delhi find their earliest origins in the construction of New Delhi as the imperial city in the early 1990s. From the beginning, the new capital was spatially and physically differentiated from the compact and densely packed spatial design of the old city, creating, in essence, two cities in one. Post-independence governments continued policies that intensified spatial fragmentation. In particular, the development of colonies for government employees created new patterns of segregation that scholars even called salary apartheid. If you look at in any city, you will find even the housing boards, they used to create different types of houses. For example, for economically weaker section, it was called EWS. For low income group, that was called LIGs, similarly MIGs and HIGs. So these colonies reproduce the colonial approach of cementing civil service hierarchies by separating the British from Indians and higher ranked of employees from the lower tied. DDA, Delhi Development Authority, was equally implicated in fostering these patterns of polarization. While it provided housing largely to middle income groups, the process of land acquisition also brought in more than 100 urban villages with much lower levels of service provisions. Moreover, the DDA's inabilities to provide adequate housing both to lower middle and low income groups encouraged the rise of unauthorized colonies and squatter settlements. There continued to be strong spatial segmentation in the city, with the south emerging as the magnet for middle and upper class residents and high end commercial activity, while the north and peripheries become home to working class and less privileged populations. A closer analysis of the Mayur Vihar Trilokpuri area in Delhi by the researchers showed another dimension of such spatial polarization. While the area attracted few new migrants, it did serve as a relocation site. New residents tend to cluster close to their kin and regional linguistic groups in a process driven by family and social networks. Social and professional networks similarly shaped co-housing in cooperative apartment societies and led to homogeneous caste and religious profiles in these middle-class gated neighborhoods. Sidhwani takes a larger perspective on the literature on segregation in Indian cities and uses Census 2011 ward level data to estimate measures of segregation for Indian cities. He finds that there is high spatial segregation by caste in big cities of India and a high degree of segregation by access to a basic public good, in-house drinking water, and by access to a basic private good, in-house latrines. Although this paper draws on the methodological approach of other scholars, it expands their analysis of segregation levels to spatial disparities in basic services provision. In their analysis of spatial inequality and its implication in the cities of Delhi and Bangalore, Gautam Bhan and Jana estimate two indices of spatial inequality using census data 2011, a proxy wealth index and a quality of housing index. They find that compared to Bangalore, Delhi has more unequal assets distribution across wards as measured by power proxy wealth index. That is, its wealth is more concentrated. Similarly, echoing DuPont's, they find that better housing in Delhi is concentrated in the center, south and east. So far, we have looked at socio-spatial segregation from the lens of caste and class. Yet, the Hindu-Muslim divide is a major feature in many Indian cities. A scholarly research has especially highlighted the patterns it produces in Ahmedabad in the state of Gujarat, a city that has witnessed periodic riots and increasing polarization culminating in horrific events of 2002. The implication of ghettoization are starkly visible as far as access to basic services is concerned. Thapan alludes to the inability of the Muslim students to gain admission into Hindu schools, about the lack of opportunity for employment, and about the denial of housing that is not divided along religion. According to Mahadevia, the city of Ahmedabad encompasses three distinct sub-cities, each of which sees its own dynamics of group segregation. The historic walled city has seen increasing separation between Hindus and Muslims. East Ahmedabad was once the industrial heart of the Ahmedabad, but even here, Muslims have increasingly moving out of Dalit-dominated chawls into their own ghettos such as Juhapura and Dani Limda. Meanwhile, the middle classes have self-segregated in gated communities in western Ahmedabad. So, how does segregation arise? We have considered the fault lines along which segregation occurs in India and the spatial ramification is social fragmentation. Yet, what are the specific mechanisms that have led to these socio-spatial patterns? At the start, it is important to note that segregation was a hallmark of modern urban planning introduced by the British in the colonial India. The native town where the indigenous population resides was clearly demarcated from the areas populated by the Europeans. The British modified the urban landscape of earlier times substantially with the introduction of what we were known as civil lines and cantonments. As both the city level case studies and data analysis show, these colonial divisions have only been consolidated in the post independence era. So, in this section, we will consider in more detail how the process of dynamic and of segregation works in Indian cities. The relationship between patterns of segregation and ethnic conflict has been widely studied, and this relationship goes both ways. While group conflict when intensifies patterns of socio-spatial segregation, segregation may further increase the likelihood of conflict, thus potentially generating a vicious circle of violence between communities. Recounting the testimonies of the riot affected in 1992-93 in Mumbai, Punwani has shown how the violence created distrust and bitterness among neighborhoods as rioters targeted Muslims in Hindu areas and vice versa. As a result, neither community felt safe living in areas dominated by the other. Substantial numbers fled to Hindu or Muslim dominated localities. Similarly, Mahadevia traces out how successive waves of riots in post-independence India, post-independence Ahmedabad, particularly over the 1980s and 1990s, led to intensifying socio-spatial segregation along communal lines. Muslims were relegated largely to the peripheries in areas such as Juhapura and Dani Limda, which evolved into de facto cities within the city with guarded and walled borders. Other Muslim areas became poorly provisioned ghettos. The importance of intercommunal civil engagement for preventing such violence is a key lesson to engage from Varshney's seminal work. While everyday forms of engagement, that is, informal interaction between communities, are helpful in preventing conflict in rural setting, riots, according to Varshney, are dominantly an urban phenomenon. In cities, formal associational forms of engagement are far more effective. This work has also suggested practical implications that these are political scientists and economists have become interested in analyzing how neighborhood characteristics affect the likelihood of ethnic conflict. Reports of young professionals being denied rental housing simply on account of their caste or housing discrimination, particularly in renting along caste and religious lines, is often in the news. Thorat discusses the forms of discrimination experienced by even highly educated, well-paid, and well-placed Dalit and Muslim home seekers in the rental housing market in the National Capital Region of Delhi. We now turn to theorizations discussed in the first section. While the categories proposed by Marcuse are intuitively appealing and at first glance seem to describe the forms of segregation seen in Indian cities, they do not necessarily fit well into close inspection. We have already noted that empirical difficulty in separating out voluntary and involuntary segregation, that is, distinguishing between an enclave and a ghetto. In her study of Muslim upper class residential choices in Aligarh, Gallonier takes on the critique that Marcuse's categories, framed in an American context, do not apply in Indian conditions. Her study shows that although the spatial clustering of Muslims academics in an area such as Sir Syed Nagar appears to emerge from a desire to live in a Muslim-dominated environment, it simultaneously also represents a kind of elite ghetto. In fact, for Aligarh's upper-class Muslims, all three motivations, threat of Hindu-Muslim riots, a desire to continue Muslim cultural traditions, as well as sharp socio-spatial differentiation from poorer Muslims, lead to spatial concentration along religious and class lines. So students, let us now summarize what we have learned in this module. So spatial segregation on the lines of caste, gender and class has implication for the questions of urban inclusion. By urban inclusion, one understands the equitable access to basic amenities such as shelter, sanitation, water, solid waste management and so on. Cities that perpetuate caste, religious and gender-based inequalities from the past and new extensions of class-based inequalities become hotbeds of inequalities and by extension also of violence and crime. So we have considered the patterns and correlates of segregation in Indian city against the backdrop of evidence and theorization from American and comparative international context. So while theorizations of segregation derived from American and international context may not apply directly in the Indian case, they offer useful insights into the ramifications of segregation in India. Most importantly, they suggest that ghettoization is an important force for segregation in Indian cities. Even where segregation is not based explicitly on class lines, it can produce patterns of profound spatial inequality and group conflict. Thank you.